I'm going to just try to give you a brief outline or interpretation of the last 30 years or so of U.S. policy toward Afghanistan, and a little bit at the end, especially about the intersection with American politics that we've seen recently. To put it really bluntly and quickly, until the Soviet invasion that we just heard about of December 1979 of Afghanistan, Afghanistan was just simply off the radar screen. Not just of the American public, but almost all U.S. officials. After that, it became the front line of the Cold War. And of course, now it's the front line on the so-called war on terror. Now, it became the front line of the Cold War in many ways because of Jimmy Carter's rather panicked response to the December 1979 invasion, which he declared the greatest threat to world peace since World War II. And his interpretation of this, interestingly enough, even though the United States was trying to wrestle with the ramifications themselves of the Iranian Revolution and the Iran hostage crisis, it occurred to few U.S. officials that the reason for the Soviet invasion had much in common with the Iranian or the U.S. response, meaning the desire to contain the Iranian Revolution. Instead, it was seen as a Soviet push toward the Persian Gulf and U.S. interests there. By the early 1980s, Washington, the Reagan administration, had fully embraced the war there, the Mujahideen struggle there, as an opportunity to hand an overextended Soviet empire its own Vietnam, and they put this in very explicit terms. They stuck it to us in Vietnam, we're going to stick it to them in Afghanistan. U.S. officials saw it as a mirror image of Vietnam in another way, in that it was a propaganda coup for Washington and for the West. As CIA Director William Casey observed in 1983, quote, "Here's the beauty of the Afghan operation. It usually looks like the big bad Americans are beating up on the natives. Afghanistan is just the reverse. The Russians are beating up on the little guys. This is what we do. We don't make it our war. The Mujahideen have all the motivation they need. All we have to do is give them help, just more of it." Now, this policy obviously paid off, as we just heard, from the U.S. perspective, in weakening the Soviets and, in fact, drastically weakening the Soviet political system, as it turned out. But the decision that you heard from Dr. Blue, the decision to funnel that aid almost entirely through Pakistan enabled the Pakistani government to strengthen some factions of the Mujahideen over others. Now, as the United States, essentially, certainly the U.S. media and public, turned inward in the 1990s, this didn't seem like a very big deal, frankly. There were news stories about the Taliban rising to power in the mid-1990s and their sort of male supremacist rule there. But the American public, frankly, didn't show a lot of interest, and U.S. officials didn't show a lot of interest. There's a little blip of interest in 1998 when the U.S. embassies in East Africa are bombed, and it emerges that al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden are behind it, and this in turn spurs the Clinton administration's cruise missile attacks, not just on Sudan, but on suspected al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan. But once again, Afghanistan falls off the radar screen in the media. Certainly falls off the radar screen as the U.S. gears up for the 2000 election, and the Bush administration, as it comes into office, seems very little concerned with Afghanistan or the broader threat of terrorism. Even after the September 11th attacks, even after it was clear, to most of those inside U.S. government who had studied it, people like Richard Clarke, the terrorism czar, that al-Qaeda was behind this and that this had probably been planned from Afghanistan, there was surprisingly little interest in Afghanistan in taking any action there among many top Bush officials. The most famous illustration of this is when they're discussing the possibilities of military actions, and Donald Rumsfeld and his deputy Paul Wolfowitz are pushing for an attack on Iraq. And others say, well, Iraq didn't have anything to do with this. And they said, well, we don't know that yet, but let's hold off on Afghanistan. And they said, but Afghanistan, this is where we need to look. And Donald Rumsfeld says, well, there are no good targets in Afghanistan. Essentially saying, let's do a war where there are good targets. Right? This is where we should choose our wars. Now, by late September, you've got CIA agents already and Special Forces agents already making contacts with anti-Taliban rebels, the Northern Alliance, they become called. October 7th, Washington launches Operation Enduring Freedom, which endures to today. Combination of airstrikes, Northern Alliance attacks, coordinated in part by the CIA. This helps topple the Taliban, or you could say actually the Taliban sort of topple themselves and flee. Discretion is the better part of valor. And in the following weeks, we saw very bold, confident assurances, following weeks and months, I should say, from Washington that this wasn't going to be a repeat of the 1980s. We'd learned the lessons of the 1980s. We're not just going to sort of obliterate and then run. This time, the United States was here to stay, here to devote the resources, the time, the energy to truly build whatever it was they were there to build, a democratic Afghanistan, they said. In fact, some Bush administration officials even discovered, to the surprise of many of us, that they believed in women's rights for the first time. Never at home did they talk about it, but all of a sudden they rediscovered it. Now, as Donald Rumsfeld's comment hinted, I think, Afghanistan was never their focus, not even when they were at war in Afghanistan. Within weeks, in fact, before the Taliban have actually fallen, the Bush administration is already shifting resources elsewhere toward a war that they're planning in Iraq. And that timing is really extraordinary, and I think the timing is critical to understand what might have been, I'm not going to say definitively, but what might have been a window of opportunity in the fall, in late 2001 and 2002, where if the United States had truly devoted resources, both military, political, and economic resources, to Afghanistan, things might have turned out differently. But instead, the U.S. helped install Hamid Karzai and really acquiesced and in many ways supported the coming to power of regional power centers of warlords, especially in Kandahar, that really detracted from any possibilities of true change in Afghanistan. Over the following year, and I think this is a year and a half, I think it's important to understand, certainly from Canada, because news was different in Canada. Over the following year and a half, Afghanistan really receded from the headlines in the United States as the lead up to war in Iraq began. And in fact, the votes for the Iraq war in late 2002 and the launching of the Iraq war in the spring of 2003, and Afghanistan really vanishes from the news almost entirely. It remains a focus for the Canadians, obviously, because that's the war that Canadian troops are involved in. But it's really an afterthought, not just for the American public, but for the White House, too, I would argue. Certainly, as the Iraqi insurgency starts in 2004 and builds up all the way through 2005, 2006, this is the focus, and this becomes a political focus at home, and I want to sort of spend the last few minutes talking about this. 2 minutes. Okay. As the congressional elections of 2006 and then the presidential campaign of 2008 are running along, it looks like Iraq is the big issue, the debate over the surge, the debate over the fate of the war. And in fact, Barack Obama launches his campaign primarily based on his early opposition to the Iraq war. And in fact, that's how he distances himself from Hillary Clinton. But a funny thing happens on the way to 2008. The violence dies down in Iraq, and this leaves him vulnerable, not just to Clinton, but to John McCain, sort of looking weak on Iraq. And candidate Obama takes a fascinating turn. He starts talking a lot more about Afghanistan, which makes sense in some ways because the violence is growing in Afghanistan. But what Obama figures out how to do is run to the left of Clinton on Iraq and to the right of John McCain on Afghanistan. It's an extraordinary balancing act he pulls off, and it helps him on both sides. And I would argue that running to the right on Afghanistan was very effective because there were a lot of liberals, even progressives, who wanted in many ways to find their inner hawks. Who want and liberal hawks, people that wanted to be able to support some sort of military effort, jumped onto this, and doves who hated the Iraq war above all else, could also support him. But this also locked him in, I would say, politically as he became president, into a policy of escalation. He made a big show of thinking about what he was going to do, but ultimately the inevitable took place. December 2009, he deploys or announces a deployment of 30,000 more troops, and Afghanistan, during his presidency, has surpassed Vietnam as America's longest war. And the last just couple thoughts here. Like Vietnam, I would argue, the objectives of this war as it goes on become increasingly unclear. The Bush rationale of not distinguishing between terrorists who who attacked the United States in their host states clearly doesn't have a lot of bearing here anymore. I mean, you could actually use that to argue for an attack on Pakistan or Saudi Arabia better than you could on Afghanistan right now, I would argue. And like I said, the window for true change may indeed have closed, but I would also say that just in terms of military efforts, as the war drags on, the United States, even as it expands the number of troops, and lots of Canadian commanders have expressed gratitude for this and around Kandahar, the U.S. officials still seem, actually I would say, ever more concerned with keeping U.S. casualties low and prioritizing that over political change, or even thinking that much about civilian deaths in Afghanistan. And the last sort of, I guess the illustration of this to me is how important air power, and especially drone strikes, have become as exercises of American power here. And what does it say about an effort you're trying to make, you claim you're trying to make politically in a country when much of your war is being fought in the air with these sort of high-tech means, not some of it in Pakistan as well as Afghanistan, and you're not even willing to risk pilots, right? I mean, these are drone planes, and they're often piloted by literally people in suburban America, who commute to work, basically play drone video games is what they're like, and then they go back to their families at night. I mean, this is how the drones are piloted, and as we can see, the damage that these things can do. When just over a week ago, 9 kids were killed by drone strikes, and I would emphasize that air power, these kind of airstrikes, they can't do positive political work, but they can be extraordinarily corrosive on the way a population views you. All right, so I'll wrap up there.